100 men, 100 sons, brothers, and lovers, each chosen for the unblemished perfection of their youth. Each promised an honor beyond imagining. A single night with the most powerful woman in the known world. They entered the perfumed chambers of Queen Shammuramat of Assyria under the silver light of a Babylonian moon. Their hearts a frantic drumbeat of anticipation and pride. They were to be the chosen consorts of the living goddess, participants in a sacred rite that would bless the empire with fertility and strength. By dawn, every single one of them was dead. Their lifeless bodies, arranged in grotesque, symbolic patterns upon the cold marble floors, were the only testament to the night's events. What unspeakable horror had transpired behind those sealed doors? Was this the act of a depraved queen, a monstrous seductress who consumed her lovers in a fit of insatiable lust? Was it the fanatical devotion of a high priestess performing a blood sacrifice of unprecedented scale? Or was it something far more chilling? The calculated, surgical act of a political genius, a gambit of such terrifying audacity that it would silence her enemies and secure her dynasty for generations? This is not a tale spun from pure myth. While the queen's name would later be warped by Greek historians into the legendary Semiramis, a figure of fantasy and fable, the core of this event is rooted in a chilling historical reality. The truth lies buried, scattered across 3 millennia, in the dust of ruined palaces and the fragmented whispers of ancient empires. It is a mystery written on shattered clay tablets, hinted at in the frantic dispatches of terrified foreign diplomats, and etched into the very bones of the victims themselves, unearthed from a mass grave that held its secret for thousands of years. To understand what truly happened inside the Queen's bedchamber in 810 BCE, we must become historical detectives. We must piece together the clues left behind, the palace inventories that recorded the purchase of 100 young men and the rare, mind-altering herbs that accompanied them, the archaeological reports that map the ritualistic placement of their skeletons, the political context of an empire on the brink of civil war. This is a journey into the heart of a dark chapter of history, an attempt to unravel the motives of a woman who, faced with the annihilation of everything she held dear, chose to commit an atrocity so profound it would echo through eternity. The answer we seek is not simple, for it is a story of how political ambition, religious fervor, and a mother's desperate love can curdle into an act of calculated, monstrous evil. To comprehend the sheer scale of Shammuramat's gamble, one must first understand the world she inhabited, a world of bronze and blood, of towering ziggurats and absolute, terrifying power. The Neo-Assyrian Empire of the 9th century BCE was not merely a kingdom. It was a behemoth, a military and cultural juggernaut that stretched from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean Sea. Its armies were the most disciplined and brutal fighting force the world had yet seen. Their campaigns of conquest immortalized in stone reliefs depicting cities aflame, impaled captives, and endless lines of slaves bearing tribute to the god-king in his capital. The wealth of nations flowed into cities like Nineveh and Kalhu, funding the construction of magnificent palaces adorned with colossal winged bulls and intricate carvings that proclaimed Assyrian dominance to all who gazed upon them. Power in Assyria was absolute, but it was also profoundly fragile. It rested on a delicate tripod of military might, divine mandate, and the unwavering loyalty of a powerful and often treacherous court of generals, governors, and priests. The king was not just a monarch. He was the earthly steward of the chief god, Ashur. His victories were Ashur's victories, his laws were the god's laws. Consequently, any sign of weakness, a lost battle, a failed harvest, a disputed succession, was not just a political problem. It was a theological crisis, a sign that the gods themselves were withdrawing their favor. Into this crucible of power and piety came the event that would set the stage for the massacre, the death of King Shamshiadad V in 811 BCE. His reign had been a constant struggle to reassert the authority his father had let wane. marked by punishing campaigns against rebellious vassals in Babylonia to the south and the Medes to the east. His death, while not entirely unexpected, left a gaping wound at the heart of the empire. The throne passed to his son, Adad-nirari III, a boy barely 10 years old. A child king was the ultimate symbol of divine displeasure, an open invitation for chaos. The vultures began to circle immediately. Within the palace walls, powerful generals and court officials, men who had commanded armies and ruled provinces, saw an opportunity. They viewed the boy king as a puppet and his mother, the regent Queen Shammuramat, as a temporary obstacle. Whispers of plots and counterplots filled the corridors. A woman ruling Assyria, even as a steward for her son, was an unprecedented and, to many, an unnatural abomination. The patriarchal bedrock of Assyrian society shuddered at the thought. Shammuramat was not just a woman. She was likely of Babylonian origin, a foreigner from a land Assyria had only recently and brutally subjugated. Her every move was scrutinized, her authority constantly undermined by men who believed the throne was their birthright. Beyond the capital's walls, the empire's enemies sensed weakness. The Babylonians, smarting from their recent defeat, began to stir, their priests calling for a holy war to throw off the Assyrian yoke. To the north, the nascent kingdom of Urartu and the restless Armenian tribes saw a chance to raid Assyria's borders with impunity. To the east, the Medes and other tribal confederations ceased their tribute payments, testing the resolve of the new regime. The great empire, built on the perception of unstoppable momentum, was grinding to a halt. It was teetering on the precipice of a full-blown civil war, a catastrophic implosion that would shatter the dynasty and leave its vast territories to be picked apart by its rivals. This was the world Queen Shammuramat inherited. She was a mother fighting for her son's life and his throne, a regent battling for the survival of an empire, and a woman defying the entire political and religious establishment of her time. Conventional methods, alliances, treaties, shows of military force were failing. The generals were untrustworthy. The treasury was being drained by constant border skirmishes, and her son was too young to command the respect needed to unify the fracturing state. She was trapped, her options dwindling with each passing day. It was in this desperate, high-stakes environment that a truly radical, terrifying solution began to take shape in the mind of the queen. A plan that would either save the Assyrian Empire or drown it in a sea of its own blood. For nearly 3,000 years, the story of Shammuramat and the 100 Men remained shrouded in the mists of myth and legend. The historical event was buried, both literally and figuratively, by those who came after. Yet truth, like blood seeping through stone, has a way of leaving a permanent stain. Over the last century, a confluence of archaeological discoveries and painstaking scholarly work has begun to drag the horrifying reality of that night into the light, transforming a lurid fable into a documented historical atrocity. The most visceral evidence emerged from the earth itself. In the early 20th century, and again in more recent decades, archaeological teams excavating the ruins of ancient Kalhu, modern Nimrud, near the site of the royal palace, stumbled upon a discovery that defied explanation: a mass burial pit. This was not a typical graveyard. It contained the skeletal remains of exactly 100 individuals. Forensic analysis revealed they were all young males, falling within a narrow age range of approximately 16 to 20 years old. They had all died at the same time, and their bodies showed no signs of battlefield wounds or plague. Chillingly, they had not been haphazardly thrown into the pit, as one would expect with plague victims or executed criminals. They were arranged with deliberate, almost artistic care, their bodies forming interlocking patterns that, when viewed from above, resembled arcane religious symbols. This ghastly discovery, a silent tableau of mass death, was a stunning corroboration of a story previously dismissed as folklore. But the evidence did not stop there. As scholars delved deeper into the vast archives of cuneiform tablets unearthed from Assyrian cities, a paper trail began to emerge. Among the mundane administrative records, ledgers of grain shipments, tax receipts, and labor assignments were palace inventories from the period of Shammuramat's regency. One set of tablets, meticulously translated, documented the sudden and unusual acquisition of 100 young male slaves. The notation, repeated for each entry, was specific and haunting: unblemished of body, pleasing of face. These were not laborers or soldiers. They were individuals selected for their physical perfection, their aesthetic qualities prized above all else. Another set of purchase orders from the same period revealed the palace had procured massive quantities of rare and expensive herbs and botanicals. The list included significant amounts of mandrake root and poppy extract. To an ancient Mesopotamian physician, the properties of these substances were well known. They were powerful sedatives, narcotics, and, in high doses, potent hallucinogens capable of inducing visions and erasing the line between reality and nightmare. The procurement of these specific substances in such large quantities, coinciding with the acquisition of 100 perfect young men, created a timeline of sinister preparation. The story was further solidified by evidence from beyond Assyria's borders. In the ruins of diplomatic archives in Mari and Elam, rival kingdoms that kept a wary eye on Assyrian affairs, tablets were discovered containing dispatches from their envoys in the Assyrian court. One such letter, from an Elamite ambassador to his king, is a masterpiece of coded terror. He writes of a great and terrible unease that has fallen over the palace. He reports that the Assyrian queen has performed unspeakable acts to prove her bond with the great goddess, and warns his king to be wary, for the palace servants speak in whispers of a night when the very walls wept blood. None who enter her presence leave unchanged. I counsel we maintain our distance from this cursed court. This was no rumor of courtly gossip. This was a formal diplomatic warning from a hardened political observer, a man accustomed to the routine brutalities of the ancient world. For him to be so shaken suggests he had witnessed or learned of something that transcended even the accepted norms of Assyrian cruelty. The final piece of the puzzle was, ironically, the silence. The official records of Shammuramat's reign are curiously incomplete. There are significant gaps in the chronicles, particularly around the year 810 BCE. Royal inscriptions that should have detailed the events of her regency appear to have been deliberately altered or erased entirely. Later, her son, King Adednarari III, commissioned new histories that conspicuously minimized his mother's role, focusing instead on his own divine right to rule. This systematic attempt to rewrite history, to scrub the official record clean, is not the action of a ruler whose mother was a benevolent and respected regent. It is the action of a successor desperate to distance himself from a legacy so toxic, so horrifying, that it threatened to delegitimize his own reign. The evidence, when pieced together, paints an undeniable picture. A mass burial of 100 young men, the documented purchase of those same men and the drugs to subdue them, the terrified reports of foreign witnesses, and a meticulous, multi-generational cover-up. The question was no longer if it happened, but why. The answer lay in the complex and terrifying intersection of Assyrian religion and politics. To the modern mind, the act of sacrificing 100 human lives to solve a political crisis seems like the epitome of madness. Yet, to understand Shammuramat, we must step out of our own world and into the spiritual landscape of ancient Mesopotamia. It was a world animated by powerful, capricious deities who demanded constant appeasement. The gods were not distant, benevolent figures. They were intimately involved in every aspect of human life, from the flooding of the Tigris to the outcome of a battle. Famine, plague, and military defeat were not random chance. They were direct signs of divine anger. Central to the Assyrian pantheon was the goddess Ishtar, known to the earlier Sumerians as Inanna. She was a deity of profound and terrifying duality. She was the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility, the bringer of life and abundance. But she was also the goddess of war, conflict, and destruction, a wrathful figure who reveled in the clash of armies and the fall of kings. To secure the favor of Ishtar was to secure both the prosperity of the land and victory in battle. To anger her was to invite ruin. For a ruler, especially one in a precarious position, her favor was paramount. One of the most important religious ceremonies in Mesopotamia was the sacred marriage ritual, or hieros gamos. In this rite, the king or a high priest would symbolically unite with a high priestess, the earthly representative of the goddess Inanna/Ishtar. This was a powerful act of sympathetic magic, a ritual designed to ensure the fertility of the land, the health of the livestock, and the prosperity of the people for the coming year. It was a reaffirmation of the divine bond between the ruler and the gods, a public display that legitimized the king's power. Shammuramat, a brilliant and educated woman, would have been intimately familiar with these traditions. She would have understood that her political problems were, at their core, religious ones. The instability of the empire was a reflection of the gods' displeasure. To save her son's throne, she needed more than armies and alliances. She needed an undeniable sign of divine favor, an act so profound that it would reset the cosmic balance and awe her rivals into submission. It appears she decided to take the symbolic rite of the sacred marriage and make it horrifically literal. Her plan was a perversion of genius. Instead of one symbolic king, she would offer 100 of the most perfect young men in the empire. Instead of a symbolic union to ensure the fertility of the land, she would enact a literal sacrifice to secure the life of the dynasty. This was not a frenzied act of piety. It was a divine gambit, a calculated fusion of religious ritual and psychological warfare. The choice of 100 victims was likely not arbitrary. The number held mystical significance in Mesopotamian numerology, representing totality and completion. By sacrificing 100, she was making a total offering, holding nothing back. The victims were described as unblemished, a requirement for any offering to the gods, be it a lamb or a human. They would be consecrated, prepared, and then ritually dispatched in the queen's own chambers, the center of royal and female power, turning her bedchamber from a place of procreation into an altar of death. The ultimate purpose of this horrific ceremony was twofold. First, on a theological level, she truly may have believed that such an unprecedented offering, a sacrifice of such immense value, would compel Ishtar to intervene on her behalf, granting her and her son the divine power and protection they desperately needed. In a world where the gods were believed to respond to the magnitude of sacrifices, Shammuramat was making the greatest sacrifice imaginable. Second, and perhaps more importantly, was the political and psychological impact. News of such an event, even as a whispered rumor, would be utterly terrifying. What kind of ruler would dare to commit such an act? Only one who was either completely mad or who possessed such an unshakable connection to the gods that she operated beyond the bounds of normal human morality. It was a statement of absolute power. By performing this ritual, Shammuramat was not just appeasing a goddess. She was transforming herself into the goddess. She was becoming the earthly incarnation of Ishtar's terrifying, life-taking aspect. She was sending a clear, unspoken message to every ambitious general and rebellious governor. I am the chosen of the gods. I am capable of anything. Cross me, and you will not face a mere army of men. You will face the wrath of heaven itself. It was a masterpiece of terror, designed to consolidate power not through the sword, but through the chilling power of a dark and bloody faith. The account of the hidden scribe, though fragmented and seared by trauma, remains our only window into the events of that fateful night. His cuneiform tablet, a small rectangle of baked clay, contains a story that still chills the soul. From his vantage point, peering through a crack in a storeroom wall adjoining the Queen's grand chamber, he witnessed a sacred ceremony descend into a methodical nightmare. The night began, he writes, not with terror, but with celebration. The Queen's chamber, a vast room hung with tapestries of crimson and gold, was filled with the scent of burning myrrh and the soft music of lyres and flutes. Queen Shammuramat herself was a vision of divine authority. She was dressed not as a mourning widow, but in the full ritual regalia of a high priestess of Ishtar, her robes adorned with gold stars and lapis lazuli. Upon her head, she wore the distinctive horned crown of the goddess, a symbol of supernatural power that made her appear more than human. The first group of 10 young men was led into the chamber. The scribe notes their beauty, their perfect forms anointed with shimmering oils, their hair garlanded with flowers. They were not afraid. They seemed euphoric, their eyes wide with a mixture of reverence and intoxication. They were served wine from ornate golden goblets by the Queen's personal priestesses, women veiled in gray whose faces remained impassive and hidden. The scribe, familiar with the palace kitchens, recognized the sweet, cloying aroma of the wine. It was laced with the poppy and mandrake the palace had procured. For a time, the scene resembled the sacred marriage rites he had heard of. The men danced with the priestesses, their movements growing more ecstatic and uncontrolled as the drugs took hold. Shammuramat presided over the scene from her throne, a detached, observing presence. The scribe writes of the moment the atmosphere shifted. At a silent signal from the Queen, the music stopped. The dancing ceased. The priestesses, moving with a silent, synchronized grace, guided each of the 10 dazed young men to one of the 10 ritual stations marked on the floor. What happened next, the scribe describes in broken, almost incoherent phrases. The text becomes a jumble of words, blades like moonlight, a soft sound, like falling fruit, the scent of iron on the air. There were no screams. The victims, lost in their hallucinatory visions of divine union, seemed to have been dispatched with a swift, silent, and horrifying efficiency. He watched as the priestesses, their gray robes now spattered with crimson, worked with the chilling precision of butchers before dragging the bodies to their designated places in the unfolding, gruesome pattern on the floor. Then the chamber doors opened again, and the next 10 were brought in. The process was repeated. The music, the dance, the drugged wine, the silent signal, the flash of blades in the lamplight. Group after group, 10 by 10, the flower of Assyria's youth was led into the chamber to meet their end. The scribe describes his own mounting terror, how he pressed his body against the cold stone wall, praying to the very gods being invoked in the next room that he would not be discovered. He writes of the Queen's demeanor throughout the ordeal. She never flinched. Her expression, he says, was not one of madness or bloodlust, but of intense, focused concentration, like a master artisan completing her life's work. She was forging a new reality, and the price was 100 souls. As the first rays of dawn threatened the horizon, the final victim fell. The grand chamber was now a silent, horrific mosaic of death. 100 bodies lay arranged in perfect, terrible symmetry. The scribe watched as another team of slaves, their faces grim, entered the room. They worked quickly, wrapping the bodies in linen shrouds and carrying them out through a side entrance. Others followed with buckets of water and sand, scrubbing the blood from the marble floors until no trace of the night's carnage remained. The scribe's final entry on the tablet was written in a trembling hand. "The sun rises," he wrote. "The chamber is clean. The empire is saved. The gods are satisfied, and I have seen the face of hell. He hid the tablet deep within the storeroom wall, a desperate act to ensure that what he witnessed would not be entirely erased from memory. He understood that the story the palace would tell was a lie, a tale of divine ascension for the chosen youths. But he knew the truth. It was not ascension. It was a calculated, cold-blooded massacre, a night of horror that had purchased the queen's power at an unimaginable cost. The sun that rose over Assyria the morning after the massacre illuminated an empire transformed, while the truth of the night's events was a closely guarded secret, held only by the queen, her priestesses, and a handful of terrified servants. The effects of her divine gambit rippled outward with astonishing speed and force. Shammuramat's gambit had worked, perhaps better than even she could have hoped. The first change was within the palace itself. The whispers of rebellion and the murmurs of discontent among the generals and nobles ceased abruptly. The air of challenge was replaced by one of profound fear and awe. Rumors, carefully seeded by the queen's loyalists, spread through the court that the goddess Ishtar had descended into the queen's chambers and taken 100 of Assyria's finest youths as her divine consorts, a sign of her supreme favor for Shammuramat's regency. No one dared to question the official story publicly. The disappearance of 100 young men, many from prominent families who had been gifted to the palace's slaves, was a chilling testament to the queen's reach and her ruthlessness. The message was clear. She was not a mere mortal to be trifled with. She was a woman who communed with gods and commanded life and death on a terrifying scale. Her power was no longer questioned. It was absolute. This new reality soon spread beyond Assyria's borders. The reports from the Elamite ambassador and others like him painted a picture of a queen who was a powerful sorceress, a ruler who drew strength from dark, bloody rituals. The advancing Babylonian armies halted their campaign and retreated, their leaders unnerved by tales of the Assyrian queen's occult power. The Medes, who had been raiding the eastern frontiers, quickly sent emissaries to sue for peace. The Armenian kingdoms to the north, which had openly mocked the idea of a female ruler, sent lavish tribute and hostages without a single demand being made. In a matter of months, Shammuramat had stabilized a teetering empire not with armies, but with a carefully constructed aura of supernatural terror. She ruled as regent for 5 more years, a period of unprecedented stability and consolidation. She oversaw military campaigns, commissioned building projects, and ensured a smooth and unchallenged transfer of power to her son, Adad-nirari III, when he came of age. But the price of her power was paid in her own humanity. Palace records from her later years describe an increasingly isolated figure. She retreated from public life, spending most of her time in her private palace, surrounded only by the gray-robed priestesses who had been her accomplices. She was a queen respected and feared by all, but trusted and loved by none. Even her relationship with her son, the very person for whom she had committed this atrocity, became strained. As Adad-nirari III grew into a man, the weight of his mother's secret seemed to press down on him. He ruled as a strong and effective king, but always in the shadow of the woman who had secured his throne. Upon her death, his actions spoke volumes. He began a systematic campaign to minimize her legacy. Official inscriptions were recarved to remove references to her most significant achievements. Court chronicles were rewritten to emphasize his own divine mandate, tracing his lineage directly from his father and the gods, with his mother reduced to a mere footnote. This was not the act of a grateful son honoring his mother's memory. It was the desperate attempt of a king trying to cleanse his dynasty of a dark and terrible stain. He could not erase the event itself. The whispers were too pervasive, the memory too deeply ingrained in the court's psyche, so he sought to obscure it, to bury the historical queen under a mountain of myth and legend. This act of historical sanitization ultimately had the opposite effect. By making her a figure larger than life, he ensured that the story, in some form, would survive. The terror and awe she had cultivated became the seeds of a legend that would far outlive her empire. The blood she had spilled would not be washed away. It would simply soak deeper into the soil of history, waiting for future generations to uncover the horrifying truth of what she had done. The journey of Queen Shammuramat's story from a suppressed historical horror to a celebrated global myth is a fascinating study in how history is remembered, distorted, and reinvented. For centuries after her death, the truth of the massacre was a closely guarded secret, a dark rumor whispered in the courts of the Near East. Her son's efforts to obscure her reign were largely successful within Assyria, where official records presented a sanitized version of the past. However, the story, in its most sensational form, refused to die. It leaked out, carried by merchants, diplomats, and traveling soldiers, spreading across the ancient world. It was the ancient Greeks, with their insatiable appetite for the exotic and dramatic tales of the Orient, who would become the primary custodians and transformers of Shammuramat's legacy. Centuries after the fall of Assyria, Greek historians like Herodotus, and later Diodorus Siculus and Ctesias, encountered these fragmented stories. They were not working from primary Assyrian sources, which were by then unreadable and buried, but from third- and fourth-hand accounts preserved in Babylonian and Persian oral traditions. These accounts had already stripped the story of its political and religious context, focusing instead on its most lurid and shocking elements. In the hands of the Greeks, the historical Shammuramat, the calculated regent of Assyria, was reborn as Semiramis, a mythological queen of impossible accomplishments and appetites. The complex political crisis she faced was forgotten, replaced by a simple narrative of ambition and lust. The calculated ritual sacrifice was reinterpreted as the whim of a depraved seductress. The story of the 100 men who died in a single night was twisted into a legend of a queen with such an insatiable sexual appetite that she would take a new lover each night and have him executed the following morning to protect her secrets. This new figure, Semiramis, was a perfect character for the Greek worldview. She was a powerful, exotic, and dangerous woman from the East, an embodiment of both the allure and the perceived decadence of Oriental empires. They attributed to her the founding of Babylon itself and the construction of its magnificent walls and legendary hanging gardens, feats accomplished by various Babylonian kings, most notably Nebuchadnezzar II, centuries after Shammuramat's time. She became a warrior queen who cross-dressed as a man to lead her armies, conquering vast swathes of Asia, from Media to India. The real Shammuramat, a regent who likely never led an army in person and whose primary struggle was to hold a fragile empire together, was lost. In her place stood a semi-divine figure, the daughter of a fish goddess, raised by doves, a woman of superhuman beauty, intelligence, and cruelty. The massacre of the 100 men, the single most defining and horrific act of her life, became a mere anecdote, a colorful detail that illustrated her legendary sexual voraciousness rather than her terrifying political cunning. This transformation reveals a critical truth about how history functions. The past is not a fixed set of facts, but a story that is constantly retold and reshaped by each new generation to fit its own values and anxieties. For the Greeks, the tale of Semiramis was a cautionary one about the dangers of female power and the supposed moral corruption of Eastern empires. For later Roman and medieval writers, she became a stock character representing tyranny and lust. Ironically, this very process of mythologization ensured the story's survival. Had the records remained purely historical, they might have been lost forever, just another obscure entry in the annals of a forgotten empire. But as the legend of Semiramis, the story took on a life of its own, captivating audiences for millennia. It is only in the modern era, with the deciphering of cuneiform and the rise of scientific archaeology, that we have been able to peel back the layers of myth and rediscover the historical queen buried beneath. In doing so, we have unearthed a story that is, in many ways, far more disturbing than the legend. The myth of Semiramis tells of a passionate, monstrous woman. The history of Shammuramat reveals a cold, rational, and utterly ruthless mind, a chilling reminder that the greatest horrors are often born not from madness, but from a cold and calculating logic. The story of Queen Shammuramat and the 100 men who died in her chamber is more than a morbid curiosity from the distant past. It is a chilling and timeless testament to the dark marriage of power, religion, and human ambition. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the capacity for calculated, large-scale atrocity is not a modern invention but an ancient and deeply ingrained part of the human story. The lines between a savior and a monster, between a sacred act and a profane one, can be terrifyingly thin, often defined by nothing more than the victor's ability to write the history. Shammuramat was not simply a bloodthirsty tyrant. She was, by all accounts, a brilliant strategist, a devoted mother, and a ruler who successfully navigated an impossible political crisis. She used the tools available to her, the religious beliefs of her people, the fear of her enemies, and her own profound ruthlessness to achieve her goals. She saved her dynasty and stabilized an empire. But in doing so, she committed an act of such profound evil that its stain could not be erased, even by the deliberate efforts of her own son and the passage of 3 millennia. Her legacy is a paradox. A queen whose success was built upon a foundation of absolute moral failure. The echoes of that night in 810 BCE still resonate. They can be heard in every instance throughout history where political leaders have invoked divine will or ideological purity to justify mass violence. They reverberate in the rationalizations of those who believe that the survival of their nation, their tribe, or their faith justifies any means, no matter how monstrous. The specific rituals and deities may change, but the underlying psychology, the dangerous belief that power grants a dispensation from common morality, remains a constant and lethal threat to humanity. And what of the 100? Ashurdan, Nabushar, Enlilbani, Shamash-Ibni. Their names, recovered from that single, damaged tablet, are a fragile monument to their stolen lives. They are no longer just a number, but individuals, sons of Mesopotamia, victims of a queen's ambition. They received no justice in their time. Their killer died peacefully, her name transformed into legend, while theirs were erased and forgotten. Perhaps, then, the truest form of justice we can offer them is remembrance. By unearthing their story, by piecing together the fragmented evidence, and by refusing to look away from the horror of what was done to them, we fulfill the desperate hope of the scribe who risked his life to bear witness. We affirm that no act of power, no matter how successful, can completely erase the truth, and that no life, no matter how humble, is truly forgotten as long as the story is told. The tale of Shammuramat and her 100 victims serves as a permanent, cautionary inscription in the annals of human history, a warning written in blood that power without conscience is the most terrifying force in the world. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane, untold historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, like, share, and comment below. What other untold historical story would you like me to reveal? See you in the next one.